Not anymore. There we go.
Better.
I think the problem is I start without an external screen and then I move to one, and that confuses the computer. So today we'll talk about Judaism, and what we'll do is, like we did last week, I'll start off and we'll then have some greater introduction to Judaism, and then Bishop Epting will step in and talk about how the church has worked on that, and then we'll have some discussion. So my introductions to Judaism go back a long ways. When I was in high school, I took a class on, I think it was called ethnic literature. And one of the books that we read was Chaim Potok's The Chosen. It hadn't been out very long way back then, but boy, was it a powerful book for me, and I loved it. If you haven't read it, it's all about coming of age, which of course for high school students made a whole lot of sense. So it started then. And then, as many of you have heard, when I went to college, I sort of ran into the Encyclopedia Judaica in my college library, and spent a lot of time reading in that while I was ignoring my other studies. And then while I was at Northwest Christian College, now Bushnell University, I really took a lot of Old Testament courses. And that, of course, blended into sort of questions about Judaism. And I took classes across the street at the University of Oregon in Judaism, but I also met the Hillel rabbi at the University of Oregon. And he introduced me to Jewish authors Martin Buber and Abraham Heschel. Buber wrote I and Thou, for those of you who may have read that. Heschel, a great scholar of the Hebrew Scriptures, but also very active in social movements. He marched in Selma, and he is famously quoted as saying, "My feet are praying," when he would march for civil rights. Also, when I was at the University of Oregon, I went to see Shlomo Carlebach. That's him in the upper right-hand corner. He was a sort of a Jewish folk singer and Orthodox, and he had so much energy and so much passion that he captivated me. His later life, there was some controversy about him, but he was a huge influence in making me interested in Judaism. When I went to seminary, I took a class in the history of Jewish thought, taught by a rabbi over at UC Berkeley, two semester course, starting from Hebrew Bible all the way through contemporary times. So I've been sort of really immersed in it intellectually. And then when I started doing campus ministry, it became even more real, as I worked with rabbis on common programming, but also addressing issues of common concern as instances of anti-Semitism arose or things like that. And that continued through my time at the University of Denver and beyond. Some of you may have seen a couple of rabbis, there they are in sort of the right center of the film, of the screen, who came to the celebration of new ministry, Elliot Baskin in front and Stephen Booth Nadav behind him. So I've been really interested in Judaism ever since, and Jewish Christian conversation as well. So like I say, my time with this goes back many, many years. So in terms of an introduction to Judaism, we're going to go back to interview with Stephen Prothero, and we'll have this will go for about 12 minutes. As you remember from the other interview with him, there's a lot of sort of static pictures. There are not a lot moving on, but it's a really, really good interview, and it will prime the pump for further conversation.
Namely, what is the problem Judaism is trying to solve, and what is the solution?
Well, Judaism is the hardest of all these religions to answer that question for. And I wrestled with it. I spoke with a lot of my Jewish friends. I did a lot of reading and thinking. But my take on it is that Judaism is the way of exile and return. The problem is exile. The problem is that we are apart from God, apart from our community, and we need to return. We need to get back to God and back to our community. And this has antecedents in the exile of the Jews from the Promised Land, the exile of the Jews from the Temple. But I think that's the main theme.
And what is the technique that Judaism recommends for overcoming exile?
Well, I think the techniques are really two. They're storytelling and law. And the two are connected. And they're connected most clearly perhaps in the Passover Seder, the table meal that Jews celebrate to remember the story of the Exodus of the Israelites from bondage in Egypt into freedom through the wilderness into the Promised Land, where you're told to remember. And to remember is a commandment. It's a good deed. It's a mitzvah. And so to tell a story, in other words, is to follow the law, because the law is to remember and to tell the story. Two different sides of the same coin.
And you say with the story and the law, it's a wrestling in Judaism between the old and the new.
That's right. And, this is one thing I love about Judaism is it isn't so much about doctrine. It isn't so much, here's the creed. I mean, you can find creeds. You can find, lists of things that Jews believe. But for the most part, Judaism isn't about belief. It's not really a belief system in the same way. It's more of a story system or a legal system. And the word Israel comes from this idea of wrestling with God. And so it's a tradition that isn't so much about, here are the 5 things you have to believe in order to be Jewish, because you can be Jewish and not even believe in God. It's more about engaging the tradition, wrestling with the story, wrestling with the law, trying to figure out what it's all about.
And so there is a sacred scripture. There is a holy book, as you called it, the Tanakh. Probably most people would know it as the Torah. What is that?
Well, the Torah is this wonderfully expansive term. I mean, it's typically translated as law, but it really means teaching, and it refers to classically the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, but it also means the entire Hebrew Bible, which is to say the prophetic books of, say, Isaiah and Amos, and then the Ketuvim, the writings, which includes the Proverbs, the Psalms, Song of Songs, Job, etc. But there's even the idea that the word Torah means debating all these things, talking about all these things, or even the conversation of Jews in Israel is also understood to be teaching or law in the sense of Torah.
And that debating is really captured in the Talmud, which is almost a document that accompanies the Torah or the Tanakh, right?
That's right, and it's a reflection that the rabbis have put together. Rabbi means teacher, and that's the name for Jewish leaders. And they look at the Talmud as this repository of debates about what to do under particular legal circumstances so that we can figure out how we're going to live our lives, which is a key question, a big question that Judaism asks. How do we live our lives in following the commandments of God?
Now, you say at one point that this was a religion born long after Abraham and Moses died. So how would you describe the founding or the founder of Judaism, or isn't there one?
What I finally come down to is it's between the temple destruction of the 6th century BCE and the temple destruction of the 1st century. So somewhere in that space is the time that we start to get this tradition that is not wedded to a temple. It's not wedded to a place. It's portable. It's textual. You can carry the book under your arm. You can carry the text. That's the key piece, the portability of the tradition. And it starts sometime in that 7 centuries of space there.
Now, sometimes Judaism today doesn't seem quite as portable, and it's linked in a lot of people's minds with the state of Israel. So where does Judaism stop and Israel begin?
Well, Israel is not the most populous Jewish country in the world. The United States is. But, Israel is the visible spot, right? This is the exile and return story that I highlight in the chapter of the book on Judaism, that here is a people who have this story of being in covenant with God and going outside of the areas that they were intended for, whether that's Eden and whether that's the Promised Land, moving into exile, and then wanting to go back. And here is the return that happens in the modern period with the foundation in the 1940s of the State of Israel. And so, yes, Judaism is very much understood to be about Israel, and yet there are Jews all over the world who have now chosen, even though there is a Jewish state, to stay in the so-called diaspora, right, to stay in the exiled space. And that continues to be something that Jews have to make sense of. You know, how can you be a part of this people that has longed for millennia for returning to their promised land, and now that they have it, to choose not to go?
And another angle on this is what constitutes anti-Semitism? This comes into the news every so often. Is it possible to critique the State of Israel or the policies or the political leaders of the State of Israel without being anti-Semitic?
Yeah, that's right. And that certainly comes up all the time in the news. You know, to what extent can you say, look, I'm opposed to this particular policy, but I'm not opposed to Judaism? And I think, you know, the memory of the Holocaust is very keen, as it should be. And it's not that long ago that Germans were, you know, killing Jews in World War II, and really very much motivated by, I believe, Christian theology, among other things. And so there's reasons to be suspicious of people who are critical of the State of Israel. That said, I don't think there's any state that we should consider outside of criticism. I mean, we certainly as Americans feel we're able to criticize our own state. I think most Israelis believe that they can criticize their own, the actions of their own state, and I don't see why people can't say, look, I support the State of Israel, but I don't support what they did in this case or in that case.
You also said Judaism, of course, is a religion of law. And there are lots of laws. Anybody who's ever looked at the book of Leviticus can, go blurry-eyed at the number of minute kinds of laws and regulations, many of which would have no application in the world today, or some of which would appear incredibly harsh. Even things like the dietary laws, which very Orthodox Jews still follow, sound a little odd to outsiders. How would you characterize the Jewish approach to law?
Well, a lot of the law comes from the Torah, comes from the Hebrew Bible, but much of it comes from the Talmud. So a lot of it's post-biblical too. I think it's a tradition that believes that God tells us how to live. And God doesn't just tell us how to live in generalities, like be nice to each other. But God tells us how to live in very specific ways, including what we should eat.
And you also say that probably the major motif in Judaism is liberation, the movement from slavery to freedom, if you will, in the Exodus, a highly influential motif, including in our own civil rights movement.
That's right. I think there's actually no story that's more influential in American history than the Exodus story. And I'm not speaking now of American Jews. I'm speaking of Americans in general. I mean, this was the story of a people, the Israelites, who found themselves enslaved under the Pharaoh in Egypt. And God called them out of slavery into freedom. And you hear, President Obama talks about, okay, there was the Moses generation of Martin Luther King, where King said, I've been to the mountaintop, I've looked over, I've seen the promised land. But he's killed. He doesn't get there. He's like Moses. And Obama talks about, the Joshua generation, the generation that does get there, the next generation. But this is something we've seen with Mormons going across to the West, seeing Brigham Young as their Moses, leading the people, the new Israelites. Americans have seen themselves as the new Israel. They've seen the Native Americans as the Canaanites. There's this real sort of literal infusion of American history into the Bible story, so that God is not only the God of the Israelites, but God is the God of Americans. And this story lives, of course, among Jews as the story that reminds them every Passover we should live our lives not just remembering the Passover story in the past, but as if we were enslaved, as if we were moving through the wilderness, as if we were seeking out our own freedom. It's a wonderful story, and it's very much an American story as well as a Jewish story.
And in fact, you say that Judaism, it's the smallest in numbers of all the 8 major religions you discuss in your book, but it has an influence way beyond its numbers. How so?
Well, that's right. And, this gets me in trouble sometimes because you start talking about the influence of Jews in world history and in American life, et cetera. There's been some pretty bad uses of those kinds of arguments. But the fact of the matter is, looking at a book like this where I'm trying to say, okay, what are the 8 great religions? What are the 8 most influential religions in the world? Is Judaism one of them? Well, in terms of its numbers, it's pretty small. There aren't that many more Jews in the world than there are people in the city of Mumbai in India, about 14 million, maybe 15. So it's pretty small. And yet, Judaism gives us the 2 great monotheistic religions outside of Judaism. It gives us Christianity and Islam, which are both outgrowths of Judaism, and those account for half of the world's population. So there's a huge influence there. If you go to the American culture, Jews are influential in politics in much greater numbers than their numbers in the population, right? I mean, we have now probably about to have 3 Jews on the Supreme Court. We have greater representation of Judaism in the House and in the Senate. We haven't had a Jewish president yet. So Judaism has an influence on American culture, on American political culture, on American popular culture. Some of my favorite comedians are Jewish comedians, and that's because the majority of American working comics are Jewish. And I don't think that that's entirely coincidental. I think there's a long tradition of wrestling in Judaism with the absurdities of life, the hypocrisies of the high and mighty, including the caprice of God. And that's funny. And Jews have made a lot of that. And they've entertained themselves, and they've entertained the rest of us too.
Stephen Prothero is a professor of religion at Boston University and the author of God is Not One, the 8 rival religions that run the world and why their differences matter. Thank you so much for joining us today, Stephen.
So to pick up his and summarize what he said really quickly, using the schema that we've been using these last several weeks, is that the problem that Judaism tries to address is exile or banishment, being outside of accessibility to God, I guess. And the solution is to return. So whether it's the Exodus, getting back to the promised land from Egypt, or returning from Babylon to Judea, or returning to Palestine from all over the world following World War II, these stories are powerful. And how do we do that, or how do Jews do that? They do it, as he pointed out, through storytelling and law, and then also tikkun olam, repairing the world. He didn't mention that one in the interview, but it's in the book. Tikkun olam is repairing the world, and an outgrowth of certainly the law and the storytelling. Who are the exemplars? Rabbis and tzaddiks. Tzaddiks are holy men, and they may or may not have been rabbis, but they are considered holy men among many Jews. So that's Prothero's schema again. I wanted to look at a few other things, and then I'll turn it over to Bishop Epting. And one of those is the way that Judaism has sort of split over the world. And I have this map here of what's known as what I've called Old World Judaism, that, of course, Judaism began there in the sort of very central part of the map with Palestine, and then it spread for various reasons. Some of it was just natural immigration, and some of it was because of dispersal. And they spread up through Europe and then across the upper part of Africa. A lot of them landed in Spain. But there were certainly a bunch that spread east into Iran, or south down into Saudi Arabia, Yemen, into Egypt, further south into Ethiopia. But then there were all of this bunch that moved for whatever reason to the west. And what happened, of course, in 1492, other than Columbus sailing the ocean blue, was that the leaders of Spain expelled the Jews. They said, you either convert or you die. And so a bunch of them left. And then the same thing happened a little bit later than that from Portugal. And those Jews that were in Spain were called Sephardic Jews. And most of them moved moved back into North Africa, and then a lot moved back towards the Middle East. There was this group of Jews that was up in Europe, known as the Ashkenazi Jews. And so we've got these three branches, the Ashkenazi Jews, the Sephardic Jews, and then the Middle Eastern Jews, which are known as Mizrahis. And a lot of time the Mizrahis get folded into the Sephardics. But of course, what happened is after, in the late 19th and through the 20th century, this huge influx of Jews from Eastern Europe. And then certainly around World War II, this major emigration of Jews out of Europe to the United States. And so Judaism in the United States really looks Ashkenazi. The food is Ashkenazi. We don't get all of that great North African food that the Sephardic Jews eat. It's just much more Northern European. So we just have to remember that we're getting in the US primarily an Ashkenazi kind of picture of what Judaism. Yiddish is Ashkenazi, it's not Sephardic. All of these things that we think of, often think of as Jewish, or at least modern Jewish, come from the European experience. Sort of subset of all of the what I was just talking about in terms of the Mizrahi and the Sephardics and the Ashkenazis, when we think about Judaism as a religion as opposed to groupings, subgroupings of ethnicity, it's all started really there in Palestine, right around the time of Jesus, a little bit earlier than that. We read about the Samaritans, and this gets back to what Prothero was talking about, law. And we'll see as we go through here how different branches of Judaism approach law in different ways. And so the Samaritans, only the Torah. They didn't care anything about the writings, the Psalms and Proverbs or anything like that, or the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, didn't care. It was just the Torah. The Samaritans still exist. They are still there in very, very small numbers. There's another group sort of like the Samaritans, only they would agree that there was, that the rest of what Maureen Fiedler talked about, the Tanakh, the Torah, and the Nebi'im, the prophets, and the Ketubim, the writings, they would accept all of that, but deny the oral Torah. In other words, everything that sort of showed up in the Talmud. Then you get this group of the Orthodox who believe that the Torah was written by God. And of course, if you're going to be truly Orthodox, you cannot say the name of God. And so therefore the G.D stands in for not getting to saying the name of God. They have developed into what is the modern Orthodox part of Judaism. Hasidim, a very sort of mystical Eastern European branch of Judaism, and then Yeshivish Orthodox, which are we see in places like Brooklyn and things like that. Again, very faithful to the Torah. They want to follow the laws insofar as they can, as they were written. So issues of kosher food, clothing, all of those kinds of things, the Orthodox really, really want to follow. Then you've got this branch, and I'm going to jump down to the Reformed Jews. They would say that the Torah was inspired by God and they don't really observe the law. It's moved into sort of the modern period, and they take the inspiration that they find in the Torah and then apply it to modern life. The conservatives are somewhere in between the Orthodox and the Reforms, and so they believe, like the Reformed, that the Torah was inspired by God, but they want to observe the law insofar as they can. So it's sort of a middle ground, and a branch of that group is the Reconstructivist group. Those two rabbis that came to my celebration of new ministry, they're both Reconstructivist rabbis. And most Reconstructivists are not so keen on trying to rebuild old world Judaism, but trying to build a sort of a new world Judaism based on old world patterns. And then you've got, like I said, some Ethiopian Jews, and then this group, this heterodox Messianic Judaism. These are Jews who believe that Jesus was the Messiah, but they want to maintain their Judaism. And there is a Messianic, several Messianic congregations in Denver. There's one that meets right at the corner of Bellevue and Holly, right at Greenwood Community Church. So this is, Judaism is not a monolith by any means. And then, of course, there are many Jews who are Jews culturally, not religiously. And you know, they may have grown up in one of these various traditions, but they don't practice. So in the US, just so you see that almost a third on the left, a third of the Jews claim no denomination. Another third, a little over a third, are Reform, 18% conservative, 10% Orthodox, and 6% other. So this was in 2013 from the Pew Research. So even in U.S., Judaism is not monolithic. But major Jewish magazine called The Forward published an article a few years ago plotting what they saw was going to happen. They believed what was going to happen versus what was going to happen with Reform Jews and conservative Jews. That conservative Jews were going to decline. That's the purple line that starts at the top and then goes down to the right. Orthodoxy was going to increase in numbers and conservatism was going to decrease in numbers. And then everybody else, the non-denominational Jews that was going to stay pretty consistent. Interesting speculation. We have seen, or at least Judaism has seen, a decline in the number of conservative Jews. There was the congregation that I attended a couple of times in Eugene when I was in college was a conservative congregation. It is no longer considered a conservative congregation. It has moved actually to the Reform side rather than to the Orthodox side. So there is movement within Judaism. So with all of that as sort of background, I'm going to turn it over to Bishop Epting.
Gary, I've got a question about your chart.
Oh, sure. Sure.
The color code that I see shows the Reform conservative increasing and the Orthodox, I'm sorry, just the opposite. The Orthodox increasing, the light blue as opposed to purple. Am I not reading that correctly?
That's right. Yeah, why, is it a return? People want more law, more structure? It's really a good question. And I don't know if they've, I certainly haven't seen any good data to say why that was going to happen. The folks within Judaism, they think that is going to happen. And they're seeing that conservatism, at least that branch, is going down. And the last that I saw was that many Reform people who worship in Reform synagogues, and maybe this will have happened with COVID, don't have sort of say, well, gosh, it's not hardly worth staying there anymore. And so because it's not that really religious, it's just sort of cultural, and we have a religious veneer, so why even go?
Okay,
but
you.
Yeah, you read the chart correctly, Whit. Was there something else beside that, or just curious?
No, thank you.
Sure. Bishop.
Thanks. Great introduction. A few years after I was ordained a priest in 1969, I picked up a book by a North Carolina priest named John Shelby Spong. It was entitled This Hebrew Lord, and it presented a Jesus who was deeply immersed in his own Jewish faith. Of course, I'd known that Jesus was a Jew, learned that in seminary, if not before. I knew that he likely never intended to form a new religion at all, but rather to renew his people, Israel, and to call them back to their original mission and prepare them to welcome in something called the kingdom of God. I had known that, but this book, written by Jack Spong, long before he became a controversial bishop and writer, was so compelling that I found myself reading the Gospels and even the whole Bible in a somewhat different way, a way which sees the original Jesus movement as just that, a movement, a renewal movement within Judaism, and a way which sees Christianity not so much as a new religion at all, but as a branch grafted onto the deep roots and trunk of the tree of Israel, as St. Paul once described it. Now, of course, Christianity is a separate religion today, but one which I believe should never forget its Jewish roots and be deeply respectful of and even reverent toward its spiritual parent, certainly the way I feel. The Roman Catholic Church, even when I read this Hebrew Lord, had already recognized decades earlier in the Second Vatican Council this fact. They stated at the council that the call of God to the Jews was irrevocable, could not be revoked, and that they would cease any targeted effort to convert the Jews to Christianity, but rather consider them as partners in Tikkun Olam, a rebuilding of the world. And that radical departure on the part of the Roman Catholic Church ushered in a whole new era of cooperation and dialogue between the two faiths, resulted in the formation of a number of organizations in this country, for example, the National Conference of Christians and Jews, which I think now has a different name, and a number of others. The National Council of Churches, which I mentioned last week, was a partner in those dialogues throughout the 1970s, but they had to, I think, looking back at it, a sort of a naive assumption that those dialogues could somehow bracket the centrality of the land of Israel for Judaism. They could somehow avoid the conversation about the increasing tensions that were taking place in the world between the Israeli government and the Palestinian people. Attempts were made by the National Council of Churches in their dialogues to study Torah together with rabbis, to plan joint action, social action, civil rights in this country, but just sort of tiptoe around the obvious elephant in the room. Things became increasingly difficult after the first Intifada, which means a shaking off or an uprising by the Palestinian people in the late 1980s. Dialogues became very difficult at that time, and the dialogue became virtually impossible after the second Intifada, which arose after the failure of the 2000 Camp David Accords, or really the failure of the Camp David Summit to reach a final agreement on the Palestinian-Israeli question. Violence started in September when Ariel Sharon, you may remember, made this provocative visit to the Temple Mount and to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The visit itself was actually peaceful, but it sparked protests and riots almost immediately. By the time I arrived in New York as an interfaith officer, it had become clear that any attempt at Jewish-Christian dialogue simply had to include discussions of the Holy Land, which the Jews believed was promised to them by God, and the Palestinians believed was stolen from them. If not by Joshua and his invading armies, then at least in the Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948, when Zionist soldiers destroyed and looted Palestinian homes and olive gardens to effect the establishment of the State of Israel. So when we set up the next round of Jewish-Christian dialogues, we agreed that to take on the Israeli-Palestine question head on, and not to tiptoe around it anymore. And to do so, we brought together teams of two to the table. The teams consisted of one interfaith dialogue officer like myself, and then one peace and justice officer, who were folks immersed in the complexities of the Middle East and the political situation there. Each participating dialogue, or each participating denomination, Christian denomination, brought a team like that, as did each of the major Jewish organizations and agencies. I remember the National Council of Churches, I think, included the Presbyterians, the Lutherans, the United Methodist Church, the United Church of Christ, and ourselves. There may have been a couple of others. The Jewish groups were represented by AIPAC, which is the American Israel Political Action Committee, the B'nai B'rith, which means Children of the Covenant, the Anti-Defamation League, and the North American Board of Rabbis. I have never engaged in a more difficult and frustrating series of conversations in my life. Every time we tried to suggest including Muslims or Palestinian Christians in the conversation, we were greeted with eye rolls, and we've tried that before and it didn't go so well. And every time we tried to bring up the legitimate rights of Palestinians, we were subtly and sometimes not so subtly accused of anti-Semitism, kind of things Prothero is talking about in his conversation. So the dialogue, at least on that level, died a fairly slow but natural death. We were devastated, and we proceeded to plan an NCC fact-finding trip to the Holy Land. The group is, you can see on the slide, we met with everyone from David Rosen, who's in the center of that picture. He'd been the chief rabbi in Ireland, but by the time we got there, he was the director of interreligious affairs for the American Jewish Committee. We talked to leading imams. We talked to the head of the PLO in Ramallah. We talked to Palestinian Christians, Eastern Orthodox and Anglican and Lutheran Palestinian Christians who reminded us that they had been in Jerusalem since Pentecost. And, you know, it's not as if we didn't know that there were two irreconcilable narratives in this conflict between Jews and Palestinians. The Jewish belief that God gave them the land, and the Palestinian belief that it was theirs in the first place. And each narrative is amazingly convincing if you listen to it articulated by its proponents. I mean, it breaks your heart to see a wall built by the Israeli government slicing up any kind of contiguous territory that might become a Palestinian state, and even cutting through family-owned olive groves of Palestinians. And it breaks your heart to speak with Jewish parents, as we did, whose children had been blown to pieces by suicide bombers in the worst of the Intifada. And while we know that Israel, partly due to US support, has one of the finest and strongest militaries in the world, when you're sitting in Jerusalem and you look to the north and see Syria and Lebanon, Jordan and just beyond Iraq to your east, Saudi Arabia to your south, and Egypt to the southwest, leaving only the Mediterranean Sea to your west as an escape, it's not hard to see why the Israelis are paranoid. What's the old sage? Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean people aren't out to get you. And they have that feeling, that sense. I had been to Palestine and Israel once before in the 1980s when I did a 2-month sabbatical at studying at St. George's Anglican College in Jerusalem. I took 2 courses. One was called the Desert Course and the other was called the Palestine of Jesus. And I had done everything during those months, from praying at the Western Wall to riding a camel halfway up the supposed side of Mount Sinai and climbing up the rest of the way on foot. And I was to travel once again with the presiding Bishop, Catherine Jeffords Shorey, in 2008, when we tried to take a generator across the border into Gaza for the Arab hospital there. It was confiscated by the Border Patrol, who told us that the PLO might dismantle it and use the parts to build missiles to launch into Israel. However likely that scenario might have been, we were a little embarrassed when PLO jeeps with machine guns carried by teenagers became our bodyguards as we met with Palestinian Christians in Gaza City. They didn't want anything bad to happen to this Christian delegation on their watch. Well, I don't know if there will ever be a two-state or any kind of solution to the Palestinian-Israeli question. I only know that I have deep sympathy and even love for both parties. I've only begun to feel a little bit at peace as to where I am with this conflict since I have joined J Street. J Street as a lobbying group in Washington, D.C., describing themselves as a pro-Israel, pro-peace group. They tirelessly work for the security of Israel, but also for the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. For me, that was a place that I could land and try to make some kind of contribution in a small way toward the healing of this terrible conflict. But for now, I simply do what the psalmist says, pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and invite you to do that as well. Let's talk about it. Not just that, but the whole suite that we've tried to cover today in quick time.
Bishop, do you want to explain this photo?
Yeah, while we were there, we visited the Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust memorial in Jerusalem. I've never been to a Holocaust memorial that hasn't left me weeping. The one in New York is absolutely amazing. But when you're in Jerusalem and you go through the powerful displays and commentary about the Shoah or the Holocaust, that also means catastrophe, by the way, it's just more than you can bear. There are lots of sculptures done in stone around the place, and this is Moses leading the children of Israel out of exile. So, one of the central motifs, as Stephen said, of exile and return. So that's you're walking not only in displays of the Holocaust, but this Jewish history just surrounds you while you're there. It's very, very moving.
Thank you. So I'm going to stop the share so that we can all get back together and see one another. I wanted to pick up on one of the things that Bishop Epting mentioned. When I first started at DU, the Hasidic rabbi, we had a Hasidic rabbi who worked with students. There was a Hillel there as well, and they worked actually pretty well together. In some campuses, they don't work very well together. But Rabbi Yossi took me to lunch, and in the course of the conversation, he says, "What are you going to do about Israel?"
Yeah.
And I said, "I don't think it's up to me. What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, basically everybody else other than the Hasids and some of the Orthodox, all the other Jews in Denver are Zionist pro-Israeli. How are you going to deal with talking to Jews in your role as university chaplain without addressing Israel in a way that's going to make everybody upset?" And I said,
Yep.
I'll cross that bridge when I get to it. Fortunately, it didn't come up very often. But and the other thing that he would say is he was definitely not Zionist, and a lot of Hasidic Jews have really no interest in Israel. And as Rabbi Yossi said, it's idolatrous to support the state of Israel. And so he was religiously against it because he thought it was idolatry to support the state of Israel religiously. So there is a spectrum of belief and understanding among Jews about the nature of Judaism and the state of Israel. So I learned that when I first came to DU. Questions, comments?
I have a comment, two comments. One, just for people's information, the Temple Sinai, which is the closest one to us, is reformed. So if you wanted to visit, I think that would be a really good place. Secondly, when they were talking about how in the video clip, they were talking about how the story of exile had motivated a lot of what Americans thought of themselves in colonizing the whole country, and how we saw ourselves as finding a new land and the promised land and all of that. As if we include the we, though, to include African Americans, it's interesting how that narrative completely switches and who becomes Pharaoh in that perspective.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was going to add, I was raised Presbyterian, and I mean, really raised. I think I was baptized when I was 2 weeks old because it was close to the time of baptism. And I always knew more about the Old Testament than any of my peers in school who went to the Methodist church.
Yeah.
Because I was well ingrained in the Old Testament. So it didn't seem strange to me that Jesus was a Jew. And because I knew that he was a Jew, there was no question about that. And the issue of the law is important in the Presbyterian church. I mean, but my mother was raised by a Methodist minister and his wife, my grandfather was, and the kosher, the food laws, she would follow some of them, such as pork. I never got a piece of bacon that wasn't unbelievably cooked. I mean, it was black, and it was because of health. And I remember when we started to talk about circumcision and the fact that that was a health decision. There were many of those laws that aided good health. My husband was born Roman Catholic, but he couldn't urinate as an infant, and he was circumcised on the kitchen table by a doctor because they wanted to make sure he could wet himself well. So many of those laws had basis in just good health, and were practiced by Protestant Christians who felt that the law was still valuable. Now, it wasn't Friday night, but on Saturday night, my Aunt Clara, who was a contract bridge player, wasn't a gambler, but by God, she could have been one if she was one. The cards and the games were all folded up. Everything was put away because it was a Sabbath. My grandmother did not cook on Sunday. Everything was done. So the Sabbath was a day of rest. My brother, who was 9 years older, always resented that the kids couldn't play. By the time I came along, there were grandchildren and we got to play on Sunday. So there was a lot of the laws that we Protestants somewhat followed, and then we decided to loosen up on because it got in the way or whatever, you know. And I think that's had a lot to do with American Judaism, as I do with American Catholicism. It's different here. It's the interaction and the sharing that is, I think, important. The other thing I've thought about, I saw Belfast this weekend, and I highly recommend it. And it is a good example of how people with different ideas of what is right can become destructive and harmful and hurtful, and how that's seen in the eyes of a child. It's really a good story about a child dealing with this. And I think that Israel and Palestine need to come to terms. They need to sit down, and they need to understand they both believe in the same God, and that yes, Israel was promised land. And when Israel walks into that land, it does tend to bloom. They're farmers, came from Europe anyway, and they want to bloom it. And the Palestinians, in many ways, are still more nomadic, except they've learned a lot about oil and gas. And I think they need to figure that out. Part of it, in my opinion, was they did not go for a true democracy. They went for a theocracy, and that gets in their way, just like it did in Northern Ireland. It gets in their way. So that's my 2 cents.
Hey, Gary, I have a question. I'm not sure if we have time. I don't know when this ends, but are you going to
go ahead, ask.
Okay, yeah, I will go ahead and ask and see how it goes. So, as you know, the Good Book Club has Exodus as the reading for this year. And I kept thinking about, why did they choose Exodus? And because it's very much storytelling, and I think it's very in keeping with what we've discussed today. And the only idea that came to me was they must have chose it at this particular time in our lives because it offers a story of personal diaspora that it could be an exodus out of virus or an exodus out of political discourse or lack of. But I want to hear what your personal speculation was about what Exodus can teach us right now, at this moment in our lives.
That's a great question. I was kind of curious about that too. And as the folks who put the Good Book Club together said, this is the first time they ventured out of the New Testament. And so why this particular one? Is it moving out of COVID into some sort of promised land, and we're still wandering through the wilderness? I don't know, but what was fascinating is that the original intent of the Good Book Club is that it would be over before Lent began. But I think they realized that you can't do all of Exodus in that period of Epiphany. So they've continued it on to Easter. And so I don't know. Bishop, do you have an idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably right. Also, there's a lot of writing today or thinking about the church itself being in exile today, that we were on top of everything for so long, we called the shots and all the rest, and now we're very marginalized. Certainly mainline Christians are, and so how do we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? And I think that may have been a motivating factor for them choosing that as well. But all those factors come together. This is a time of exile and return, whether it's COVID or politics or the church itself in the world today.
Got
an observation about the interview with Prothero, and that is, he said something that really caught my attention, and that is that you can be a Jew and not believe in God.
Yeah.
I thought the whole basis of one God, the great I am and all, came out of Judaism.
Well, I remember reading a book early on when I was in college, and there was a book that came out called, what was it? Christian Jew. What was I can't remember exactly. Anyway, but there was a whole question about what is a Jew. And there was a big article a long time ago about what is a Jew. Is it somebody who is ethnically a Jew, somebody who was born of a Jewish mother? That defines you as being a Jew. You can convert into Judaism. If you're born of a Jewish mother, you're Jewish. Has nothing to do with whether or not you practice a religion. And so there's this overlap between an ethnicity and a religion that really is epitomized by Judaism. And so there are plenty of secular Jews who want nothing to do with religion, but they will certainly celebrate a Passover meal. They'll do a lot of the holidays, because those holidays remind them of being kids or whatever, but they really don't have anything to do with the religious side. And that really came to a fore after World War II, when nobody could understand how God could let the chosen people suffer the Holocaust. And so the question of, is there a God, became really prominent among many intellectual Jewish circles, not just in Germany, but all around the world. So they will still practice many of their traditions. They may be, sort of the Jewish equivalent of Christmas and Easter Jews, and they'll show up at the high holidays at synagogues. The one time a year they will, but they are, for all intents and purposes, either atheists or certainly secular.
The whole idea of the ethnicity of Jews in Judaism has been in the news lately, with Whoopi Goldberg got suspended from The View because she said that the Holocaust was not racism. They said it's just a bunch of white folks fighting each other, she said. And the Jews came down on her with both feet. They said it absolutely was racism. The Nazis believed that we were an inferior race, and we are an ethnicity as well as a religion. We're defined not by our creed, but by our birth.
It was just during that interview when it struck me that we were talking about Judaism as a major religion.
Sure.
I took that to mean that you can be a Jew by religion and still not believe in God. So It was just odd to me.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of Christians who think like that too. They come at Christmas and Easter.
Yeah.
They like the celebration, but they aren't there every Sunday like you and I are.
Well, I think, Whit, and this goes back to a question that you raised before, is that maybe part of what this discussion is raising is the whole question of how do we define a religion and what makes up a religion. We talked about Buddhism being a non-theistic religion. Can you be Jewish and not be religious? It raises the question of what is it that comprises a religion or forms a religion. Other thoughts, questions? Got a few more minutes.
I can't believe that we went the whole time without talking too much about Sabbath, but I think that is such a great gift that Judaism has given us. And as Erm was pointing out, there was a time when our Christian Sabbath, which was Sunday, was very much observed in the same way: rest, going to church, being with family, not shopping, and all the rest of it. I certainly remember that growing up. And but however you define it, Sabbath is an important time. Important gift to us. You step back from your work and trying to define yourself by what you do, and instead you just rest in the presence of God. Whether you do it on a Sunday or a Saturday or a Friday, as the Muslims do, or just find a time in your life to do it, it's an important discipline.
Anyone else?
I have two Jewish friends who were once Christian, and they were born into Christianity, but became Jews. And they were, the nation of Israel will welcome anyone who is Jewish to their ranks. And the idea is that if you're in a country that ultimately turns against you, you have a place to go. And that was one of the huge reasons for having Israel at all in the modern time. But for them to become a Jew that would be welcomed into Israel, having converted, not being born to a Jewish woman, they needed to prove it. And they're both attend Temple Sinai, which is Reformed. And in order to prove it, they had to go before a board of 3 rabbis who were Orthodox before Judaism would accept them and put them on the rolls. Before Israel would accept them and put them on the rolls. And both of them did that to make travel there easier and also to have a homeland. So
yeah, I took a group of students when I was at DU and teaching a course on other religions, but we went to Temple Sinai, and the rabbi came in to talk to us. And so here all these students are sitting in the main hall of the synagogue, the sanctuary, looking down to the front, and there's the beam and all of this. And on one side's the American flag, and on the other side's the Israeli flag. And the rabbi had on his lapel pin, he had crossed American and Israeli flags.
Yeah.
And that really struck the students. They couldn't, they were having trouble getting their mind around that being that obvious in the religious space. These flags were up front. They weren't at a side or in back. They were up front. And the students were really struck by that. Talked about it a lot after that meeting.
Hey, Gary.
Yeah.
Dare I close this with Prothero's distinction about the branches of Judaism?
Oh, yeah, that's great. Go ahead.
I hope I won't offend anyone. Stephen Prothero says that one way to separate these, at an Orthodox Jewish wedding, the mother of the bride is pregnant. At a conservative Jewish wedding, the rabbi is pregnant. At a Reformed Jewish wedding, the bride is pregnant. And at a Reconstructionist Jewish wedding, both brides are pregnant. Sorry.
It does. If you sit back and think about it, it does help explain the difference between those various groups.
Yep.
And I think that that's a great way to close this. So next week, we'll be back and talk about Islam as the last of the major religions of the world that we'll talk about. And then the week following that, we'll talk about how we deal with other Christians, which is always thornier than dealing with other religions. So anyway, thank you all. Look forward to seeing many of you in person next week. Take care.
Thank you, Father.